city, the most beautiful in the Mediterranean, and all kinds of people were living there. Turks with their fezzes, and beautiful Greek ladies with their hats, and Englishmen. And it was all destroyed. How could that be?
The 19th century Mediterranean world was dominated by cosmopolitanism. This was the time of extensive east-west commerce that went through the Mediterranean. And the points of contact between the east and the west were several large commercial cities which enacted the trade. These were cities that had a number of ethnic groups which intermingled and had a particular unique cosmopolitan character. These cities have been celebrated in art, literature, and poetry, and are well known: Alexandria, Constantinople, Salonika, and Smyrna.
Smyrna at the beginning of the 20th century was one of the most colourful, richest and opulent cities in the Ottoman Empire. It was on the western coast of Turkey, washed by the warm waters of the Aegean, and it was incredibly wealthy. It stood at a crossroads between east and west, and people from all over the world had poured into the city, giving it a unique and quite amazing cosmopolitan character. The principal nationality here were the Greeks, but there were also numerous Turks, Armenians, Jews, Europeans of every nationality had come to set up home here. And then the Americans had come at the beginning of the 20th century as well. The American consul George Horton said that in no city in the world did East and West meet in so spectacular a fashion. It really was a unique and very, very cosmopolitan, tolerant city. There's a wonderful account by a French journalist who steps ashore one summer's day onto the quayside of Smyrna. And he's amazed because within the first few minutes of landing, he's heard virtually every language under the sun and met all these different nationalities. Then he begins to walk down the quayside and he describes seeing all these people in their different national costumes, which is quite amazing. Armenians in their long robes and their hats, Turks in their fezzes, there's British in their top hats and bowlers, Austrians in their Homburgs. And then he steps into bars and cafes, and he sees all these people sitting alongside each other, the Turks with their hubble-bubble pipes, the Greeks sipping their coffee, the British with their cups of tea. And it gives a wonderful sort of flavour of just how international and cosmopolitan this city was. There was jazz, there was classical music, there was Italian operettas spilling out their music onto the quayside. And then you had notices in French, notices in Italian, a real mishmash of people, nationalities, languages.
When I'm asked where I come from, I always reply, I'm from Smyrna in Asia Minor, although I was not born there. But this heritage weighs so much in my heart that I always profess that my country of origin, my city of origin is Smyrna. Smyrna puts a smile on my face because it was a happy city, despite all the difficulties and the problems. Smyrna was a place where people had fun, worked hard and played hard. They had the sea, they had the farms, they had the produce. In Smyrna, the poorest of people could lead a good life alongside the rich and the wealthy and the famous and the foreign and the Greeks and the Muslims and the Armenians.
Smyrna was a cosmopolitan city. It was also an Ottoman city. It belonged to the Ottoman Empire and was governed according to the rules of the empire. The Muslims were first-class citizens and the non-Muslims were second-class citizens. However, they were given some rights. The first was immunity from local legislation. The second one was immunity from local taxation. And there were many Greeks, Armenians, and Jews that had foreign citizenship and were able, therefore, to take advantage of those set of privileges given by the capitulations.
Smyrna was a very unusual city. It's divided into loads of different quarters, with every nationality having their own different quarter. And what visitors would like to do is sort of process through all the different quarters, getting the sights and sounds of each quarter, if you like. The biggest and the richest, perhaps, was the Greek quarter. This was a place of incredible life and vitality. Imagine very imposing stone mansions. The Greeks were wealthy, and they liked to show their wealth. So you can walk through these streets, and at times of the fig harvest, it was quite amazing because the streets were full of camels bringing figs from the hinterland, the countryside around Smyrna. So people would like to come through, start in the Greek quarter, and then they'd move on down into the Armenian quarter, and the Armenians also were very wealthy. So when you walk through their quarter of the city as well, you saw these wonderful buildings. And linking the two was Frank Street. Now this was the principal street in the city, and this is where all the wealthiest shops were, where the department stores were. And there are accounts, but written by people actually who are still alive in their late 90s, who remember going into these stores and seeing the most wonderful selection of every single imported item under the sun. Everything from all over the world came into these department stores. You could buy anything you wanted. Continue down Frank Street and you come to the Jewish quarter. This is much poorer, much more squalid. And then next to this, adjacent to this, go sweeping right up the slopes of Mount Pegasus, is the Ottoman quarter, the Turkish district of the city. This is what all the visitors wanted to see, because this is where you got a flavour of the Orient. All the Turks were still in their costumes, they're smoking their hubble-bubble pipes. This is where you saw Turks in their fezzes, you saw the water sellers, you saw the Muslim holy men. This was a very poor part of the city, but very interesting, if you like. Next to this, or behind this, you have the American colony, which was called Paradise. The Americans had poured into the city at the beginning of the 20th century, and they found it the most wonderful place on earth. They named their colony Paradise in honor of this. And then behind this, you have the Levantine suburbs of Bornabat and Cordelio, which is home to the great Levantine dynasties. These people of European descent who'd settled in Smyrna some 2 centuries earlier. And here they lived enchanted lives in spectacular pleasure palaces surrounded by botanical gardens, getting on with their neighbors, the wealthy Greeks and Armenians, who'd also moved out to these leafy suburbs.
The Greek community came from different parts of Greece, from the islands mainly, but even from the mainland. And they were industrious people who went there obviously to make their mark, their economic mark, and blended into a society that had its prototype in the Occident, Occidental prototypes, in an Oriental environment. And the combination of the two yields this interesting hybrid, the Greek from Smyrna. He's Occidental in his multilingual habits, in his education, in his preference for Western Europe, but also laid back, open to the pleasures of life, this joie de vivre with its Oriental trimmings, so to speak.
I think I'm here because my grandmother on my father's side and my grandfather were born and grew up in Smyrna and had to leave in 1922 with the Asia Minor disaster. And they end up in Salonika, which is where my father was born and where I was born later. And I feel that I'm slowly gaining the license to try to uncover Smyrna and even try to find a way to talk about it that does justice to my Greek family, but also does justice to the discipline of history. And it's important to point out that not all Christian Greeks from Smyrna were there for generations and generations. They often moved there because of political reasons, like my great-grandfather was originally from the Peloponnese, had got in trouble with the Ottomans and moved to Smyrna. On my grandmother's side, they came from Crete. I think that also reinforces that fluidity of movement and the fact that Smyrna was a place of opportunity in a good sense, and it was an accepting place and an attraction, a magnet.
The Greek community in Smyrna was the largest non-Muslim group. They numbered about 80,000 at the end of the 19th century, and that number grew to about 120,000 by World War I. The community was so big that it included wealthy merchants, white-collar professionals, many small shopkeepers, and many other Greeks who were not as wealthy. And Kosmas Politis, in his award-winning book Stu Hadzifrangu, describes the ordinary lives of the Greeks in the poor neighborhoods. The Greeks in Smyrna had a number of schools which were so good that they were considered on a par with the schools in Athens. The church was also important. The city was dotted with Greek Orthodox churches, and in 1910 the church in Smyrna acquired a powerful leader, Metropolitan Chrysostomos. The Greeks were close to the Armenians, who were another community. They were smaller. They were about 12 to 15,000, and that number grew to about 20,000 around World War I. And they had close relations with the Greeks because they were Christians as well. And the Armenian social structure was similar to the Greek one. There was a wealthy group involved in trade. There were white-collar professionals and also small shopkeepers as well.
when people ask my place of birth, I would say Smyrna, Turkey, but I am not a Turk, I'm an Armenian. My memory goes back to my childhood, which was a happy childhood. My father was an international business people, and he had a department store which imports from Germany and France. And we lived in a beautiful home. I remember the homes very in detail, where there was a large credenza, golden with a mirror, a Louis XV French type thing, and large rugs on the floor, a long living room with windows in the front of the street. And we had another home in Cordelio, across the water, with the lights. And my grandfather used to raise tobacco. I smelled the tobacco leaves hanging in the hanger, drying. We used to go there to my grandfather. We were happy, comfortable people. So that's how my life began.
The Muslims of Smyrna numbered about 80,000. And the curiosity about the Muslims in Smyrna is that they were a minority in what was a city in the Ottoman Empire. And that is why Smyrna was described by Muslims across the Ottoman Empire as infidel Izmir, because in fact the Muslims there were a minority. Most of them were involved in menial tasks, manual labor, and their neighborhood was on the slopes of Mount Pagos, or Kadifikale as it's called in Turkish. There was also a white-collar group among the Muslims. They were the bureaucrats, so all the government officials and all the port officials of the Ottoman Empire were Muslims, and there was also a small Muslim elite. They were mostly landowners who owned land in the rural areas surrounding Smyrna, such as Manisa, and they had big wealthy houses in the city, and they also interacted with the Levantines, the Greeks and the Armenians, and the few wealthy Jews.
I have a personal connection to Smyrna as well as a research interest, and so I was fascinated to hear the life story narrative of Gülfem Kağıtçılar İren, who came from a very old Muslim Izmirian family who lived there during the cosmopolitan years. Gülfem İren was born in Karşıyaka or Cordelio, and from family stories knows very well the earlier years. She talked about Izmir's dialect, where so many words are Greek or Italian, and she said Izmir is very different from Istanbul. In Izmir, the Muslims live in a Levantine world, and the best of everything could be found. She told me about her family. The Katipzade were feudal landowners, and they had a family estate in Manisa. They also owned real estate in the European quarter, and they had a foundry, a factory that produced rose oil, and one that produced silk thread, and all their products were exported to France.
The governor of Smyrna in the period before the First World War and during the First World War was Rahmi Bey, an Ottoman governor of the old style, highly educated. He spoke apparently impeccable French. He dressed in a frock coat and top hat and liked to wander around the city twirling his silver cane. He loved the Levantine dynasties. He loved drinking gin slings with the Europeans and just talking for hours into the early hours of the morning, talking about how he ran his city. Because it was a very difficult city to run. because Rahmi Bey, a Muslim, was in charge of a city whose majority population was Christian. So Rahmi Bey was continually having a juggling act, basically, having to try and keep each community in his city happy. In a city with so many different nationalities, Rahmi Bey was really reliant on all the different consuls of all those different nationalities who lived in the city. And none, perhaps, was more interesting than the American consul, George Horton. George Horton, he'd married a Greek woman and spoke fluent Greek, so he was well placed to be a consul in the city. And he was incredibly gregarious and outgoing. He just loved the city. He loved being posted here, and he spent all his time forever going to parties and drinks and socialising with all the different communities in the city. And his accounts give a very colourful flavour of just what was going on and just the mix in the city at the time.
The 19th century may have been the century of cosmopolitanism for Smyrna, but for most of the rest of the region, it was also the era of rising nationalism. Greece, Bulgaria, and Serbia began launching territorial claims against the Ottoman Empire, wishing to push the Ottomans out of the Balkans and divide Macedonia and Thrace among themselves. The Greeks had a bigger plan, the so-called Great Idea, which really consisted of a vision of including all historically Greek territories populated by Greeks within the Greek borders. And within that vision, there was not only Macedonia and Thrace, but also the Asia Minor coastline, including Smyrna.
At this time of luxury and fun in Smyrna, it was a very different story was taking place elsewhere in Turkey. There were scattered groups of Greeks living right across the country. In every town, in every village, there were loads of Greeks who'd been left over from the old Ottoman Empire. And after 400 years, many of them had forgotten their Greek roots. They'd even forgotten how to speak Greek. But intellectuals and priests from Athens started going out into Turkey and encouraging these Greek communities to relearn their Greek, to reconnect with their Greek heritage, if you like. But none of this would have had any effect whatsoever were it not for one man, Eleftherios Venizelos, who was destined to become the Greek Prime Minister. He had a dream, and his dream was to reunite all the Greeks of Asia Minor, a spectacular vision, if you like. But even Venizelos, energetic as he was, could not have pulled this off without the support of one man, and that man was David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain. He loved this idea. He thought this was fantastic, and he said he would do everything he could to make sure that the great idea came off.
Throughout the 19th century, the Greek state was expanding, and not just the Greek state, the entire Balkan territory. All the Balkan states were expanding at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. Much of this expansion, of course, was dictated by nationalism and irredentist nationalism. The Ottoman Empire began to experience nationalism in a later stage, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And the first outburst of a nationalist movement in the Ottoman Empire were the Young Turks in 1908. The Young Turks were responding to the diminution, to the shrinking of the Ottoman Empire.
The simmering tensions between the Greeks and the Turks really exploded in 1913-1914 with the Balkan Wars, when the nations came head-to-head on the battlefield. And the upshot of this was enormous numbers of refugees, Turks from Greece, who were kicked out of Greece and had nowhere to go. Well, they had nowhere to go, but the Turkish government encouraged them to settle in the areas with the largest Greek populations in Asia Minor, namely all the villages and towns along the coast around Smyrna. And there's an amazing account by a French archaeologist, Félix Sartieu, who was working in the village of Old Fokia at the time. And he describes the refugees arriving, and they arrive with chetes, who are these armed, heavily armed, irregular forces. And Félix Sartieu saw everything that happened, and he was absolutely appalled, because the chetes came in with their guns, with their pistols, and they caused absolute chaos, attacking, ransacking, raping, pillaging, and killing numerous Greeks in the village. And what took place there was the first hint of this ethnic tension, this ethnic conflict that was soon to rock Smyrna itself. What's perhaps remarkable about the story of Old Fokia is that it's so close to Smyrna. And yet in Smyrna itself, people carried on their daily lives, they carried on their boating expeditions. It was as if they were willingly blind to what was taking place around them.
Those memories also come back again when my father used to take us very nicely to the quays, the docks of Smyrna, where they had the restaurants on the water. And he used to take us there, and we would see the water and all the crowds and the people. And I remember my mother and my father used to go to a ball, and there was a place where there was a dancing and so on, and they would go for a dance.
Life was very busy in Smyrna, and the name days for the Greeks were a time of great celebration, but also of great preparations, in that the house had to be ready, the food had to be cooked, the furniture had to be cleaned, the carpets, the silver had to be polished, so the musicians had to be booked for the party. And parties like that were the life and soul of Smyrna in the early 20th century.
In the summer of 1914, World War I broke out, and the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria. Smyrna would be for a while insulated from the effects of World War I, but not so for the rest of the empire. Now the non-Muslims had to join the Ottoman army, something that they could avoid in the past. But of course the authorities didn't want to arm the non-Muslims, so they conscripted them into the labor battalions. These were units that did hard labor, and thousands of people lost their lives through the awful living conditions that they had to experience.
In the spring of 1915, the American consul George Horton had a visitor knock at his door in the American consulate. His name was Walter Geddes, and he'd been travelling through the eastern parts of Turkey. And he came back with the most horrific tale imaginable, that all the Armenian population, the towns and villages of eastern Turkey, were being deported and exterminated. They were either being sent into the desert, or they were being shot and picked off in cold blood. Now, this was complete news to Horton, but the story soon got far worse. The policy was being dictated by central government in Constantinople. Talat Pasha wanted the Armenians out of Turkey. It was all part of Turkey for the Turks. And Talat also wanted the Greeks out of Turkey as well. Now, Rahmi Bey was, of course, going to be affected by this policy because Talat wanted the Armenians and Greeks out of Smyrna as well. He was going to do everything he could to try and protect them. And perhaps the most enduring image from the First World War, from Smyrna, is a photograph from 1917, the real dark days of the First World War, when the assembled population of Smyrna, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Levantines and other Europeans, are sitting in the opera house listening to Verdi's Rigoletto. In 1917, Venizelos joins the Allied war cause, sending his troops into battle on the side of the Allies. Because he now knows the war is in its final stages, it's almost at an end, and with Turkey defeated by the Allied powers, he's awaiting the rich reward, which is the city of Smyrna. In 1917, America joined the war on the Allied side. By this stage, the war was almost at an end, and it was evident to everyone that America was going to play a lead role in deciding who got what in the aftermath of war. And so it was that the peacemakers all assembled in Paris: Wilson, David Lloyd George for Britain, Clemenceau for France, and Orlando for Italy. And there was an amazing conference where a great bargaining game began. Wilson, the American president, rose above it all. He came with a principle, and his principle was self-determination. People should rule themselves. Now, Venizelos, being a very wily and shrewd politician, seized on this instantly. Aha, he said, if people can rule themselves, then the Greeks of Smyrna, the majority, should be allowed to rule Smyrna. Venizelos at the conference played a most fabulous role. He was talking about classical Greece, he was giving lectures. People were entranced. All the British diplomats who were there, they wrote about how wonderful this man was. And by the end of the conference, there was a feeling that indeed Greece should be given these lands that were rightfully Greek.
I think Venizelos' greatest success was to allay the fears of Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson, who was against taking over Asia Minor and parceling it out. He was adverse to that. And it did a lot of convincing on the part of Lloyd George to secure his agreement for Greece's mandate in Asia Minor. Some people still think that Greece was given the right to annex Smyrna. Not so. It was given a mandate to keep the peace in the region, mainly because the Italians were too anxious to take over much of southwestern part of Asia Minor. The Brits didn't want that. They would rather have Venizelos be there rather than the Italians. So Greece was given a mandate to maintain the order there for 5 years, and in 5 years' time there would be a referendum which would give the Greeks the opportunity to annex the territory of Smyrna.
Rumours of the Greek landing had reached Smyrna already, and there was fantastic excitement that finally the Greek army was going to liberate the Greeks of the city. And already by about 6 in the morning, the quayside was absolutely packed with thousands of Greeks who'd flocked there to witness the triumphal arrival of the Greek navy. And it was about just a few minutes after 7 o'clock when the first funnels were seen over the horizon. People were cheering, a great jubilation. Everyone was fantastically excited that after all these long, terrible years of war, at last, liberation was at hand. And it wasn't just the Greeks celebrating, or just the Armenians celebrating. Also the Europeans as well, who had gathered to watch this historic arrival. There were accounts of the sporting club where all the Europeans and Levantines, all dressed up in full morning dress and everything, were there and standing on tiptoes waiting to catch a glimpse of the Greek fleet. The Greek jubilation was met by corresponding despondency on the part of the Turks. There was a huge demonstration up on the hillside above the city, demonstrating against the Greek invasion. The Greeks came in. They had a very strategic plan to encircle the city with their troops and to drive a wedge between the Greek and Turkish quarters of the city to forestall any violence. But when this band came to land on the quayside, they landed at the wrong place. Whether that was deliberate or not, we just don't know. But they landed there to great jubilation on the part of the population, and Metropolitan Chrysostom, the head of the Greek church in the city, stepped forward in full church vestments and blessed the army as it landed. And then he said he was going to lead them on a triumphal procession down the quayside, not at all leading them to drive a wedge between the Greek and Turkish sections of the city. Off they went down the quayside to the cheering of the crowd, and suddenly a shot is fired by someone. We don't know who. To this day, no one knows who fired that shot, but it came from the quarantine building on the quayside. The response from the Greek army was dramatic and violent. They reached for their guns and they started shooting at the quarantine. And the quarantine had many Turks inside it, all armed to the teeth as well. And what happens is a 20-minute violent gun battle that takes place. After 20 minutes, the Turks have got no ammunition left. They leave the building, and the Greeks march them back down the quayside, stabbing them, beating them, shooting at them, and those that survived were taken prisoners.
Gülfem İren told me she has a few memories of the Greek occupation of Smyrna. She told me that her father was saved by his Greek friends. During the day of the occupation, they hid him in the Greek club. And the next day, she remembers he came home accompanied by the kavas, or the guard of the Greek club. She told me about his blue uniform with gold embroidery, which she still remembers. And he was wearing a hat rather than the usual fez. So it was his friends and his knowledge of the Greek language that saved him.
Venizelos decided to address the problem of rising tensions in Smyrna following the Greek occupation by appointing a fellow Cretan and a friend of his, Aristidis Steriadis, as governor. In some ways, Steriadis was the last chance for preserving the cosmopolitanism of the city. He was committed to the city's multi-ethnicity. He believed strongly that the Greeks, despite the fact that they were in charge of the city, should treat the other groups equanimously and with equality, and tried as best he could to bridge the widening gaps among the Greeks and the Muslims and the other communities as well. In order to do so, he was obliged to take very strict measures. And needless to say, those strict measures alienated both sides.
The work of Aristidis Steriadis and his team has not been studied, has not been published. When this is done, Steriadis will emerge as a protagonist who accomplished a great deal amidst the sea of troubles, treating everybody equally and trying to do his best to create a multinational, cosmopolitan society that the essence of Asia Minor had always been. The main areas of success of Aristidis Steriadis' Greek administration were national health, where he created the most progressive national health system free to all nationalities, the return and rehabilitation of Christian refugees of the 1908-1918 period, Some 150,000 of them returned and were rehabilitated. And last but not least, the organization of a university that was to be the most progressive and open and outward-looking university that would cater for the languages and for the civilizations of the area, which would be studied in detail. The aim was for the nationalities to live next to each other without any problems, as they do live today in New York or in London or everywhere else in a cosmopolitan context.
The arrival of the new Greek administration brought about a complete transformation to the city of Smyrna. Overnight, a new renaissance set in. There was loads of wealth in the city. People poured back into the city, merchants from all over the world, from Greece, from Europe, from America. It was a wonderful time, but correspondingly, on the other side, the Turks were horrified by what had happened. And in Constantinople, a remarkable lady, a member of the bourgeoisie named Halide Edip, gave public addresses to vast crowds saying that Smyrna had to be liberated from the Greeks. Halide Edip very quickly became a reviled figure amongst the British and Allied forces who were in the city at the time, and it wasn't long before she and her husband had to flee from the city, flee to the east, to the heartland of Anatolia. When Halide Edip arrived in eastern Anatolia, the first person that greeted her was a military official by the name of Mustafa Kemal, a rather brilliant general who'd fought with distinction in the First World War. Mustafa Kemal was deeply unhappy, deeply disturbed by the landing of the Greek army in Smyrna, and suddenly he turned everything on its head and decided, instead of working for the British and the puppet government of the Sultan in Constantinople, he decided to work against them. He decided to launch the nationalist movement, setting up his alternative rival nationalist government, and in the city of Ankara he established the Great National Assembly, which would try and represent the whole of Turkey and would work out how best to get the Greek army out of their country. The situation in Smyrna had never been rosier, but in the countryside just outside the city, in all the little villages and the farms that were scattered around, there was terrible violence was taking place. The Greek farmers were constantly finding themselves under attack from Turkish nationalist forces. This placed Sturgiadis in a terrible dilemma. What do I do next? How do I control this violence? And he realized that, reluctantly, the only thing he could do is send the Greek army out into the countryside beyond the parameters of the city to try and quell the violence. And this is exactly what happened. With the encouragement of Venizelos, the Greek army moves out, attacks the Turks, and every time they meet the Turks, they defeat them. It seems so easy suddenly, and they push out further. But wherever they establish their front line, the Turks attack them again, and so they push out a little bit further. And it's quite extraordinary, the defeat of the Turks and being rolled back further into Anatolia. Although war has never been declared, effectively the Greek army and the Turkish nationalists are now at war. And this war is going to last for 3 years, and it's going to become more and more brutal and bloody as the Greek army constantly pushes out across Anatolia. And they do remarkably well.
Meanwhile, in Greece, elections had taken place, and Venizelos had been defeated by his opponents, the pro-royalist party, who were opposed to the war. But King Constantine decided that he would, in fact, not stop the war, but instead continue pursuing the war, and, in fact, take over. He was, as the king, the leader of the army. And in the spring of 1921, he arrived in Smyrna, and there were scenes similar to the ones that had taken place just over 2 years earlier with the arrival of the Greek army. A population of Smyrna came out in the streets, waving its blue and white flags, welcoming the king. There was a new sense of enthusiasm and optimism about the future now that the king was committing himself to the Asia Minor campaign, as it was called, and taking charge of the army.
Constantine's decision was to extend the war to Ankara. In other words, they thought that fighting wars in the coastal areas, let's say, of Asia Minor against the Kemalist forces would not solve the problem. They felt they should enter the heart of the problem, which was Ankara. Hence, in the summer of 1921, the largest expedition that the Greek army ever experienced in modern history took place. The Greek army marched towards Ankara and gave their decisive battle in the river Sangarius in Greek, Sakarya in Turkish, where Kemal managed by the skin of his teeth to hold his position and repel the offensive.
The great powers were having a change of heart. What happened was, after the Turks showed that they could indeed confront the Greek army, the great powers began thinking to come to an agreement with Mustafa Kemal. And so Greece became exposed. Its military was exposed in Asia Minor because its transport and supply lines were being stretched, and it was being exposed diplomatically because it was losing the support of some of the great powers.
A woman in a small town outside of Smyrna that had visited Smyrna with her father a month and a half before the catastrophe was impressed by the dresses of the women in Smyrna wearing organdy and beautiful colors and coordinated hats. But she also noted that Smyrna was so sure of itself. We in the countryside could see the world changing, and we knew to be afraid. But the people in Smyrna did not have that notion. And she also discussed this very lively social life, this very exuberant social life, while the world was falling apart.
In August of 1922, the Greek-Turkish stalemate on the front was broken. What happened was, by that time, the Turkish forces were strong enough and were able to attack and defeat the Greek armies. And by late August, the Greeks had started to retreat. As the Greek forces gradually moved further back towards Smyrna, they decided, in order to defend themselves, to employ a scorched earth policy, burning and destroying towns and villages. The Greek army approached Smyrna, and one of the last big scorched earth incidents that happened was the town of Manisa, fairly close to Smyrna.
In August in 1922, Gülfem told me they had to leave from Smyrna and go to Manisa, to the family estates, for the grape harvest. And while they were on the estate, Manisa began to burn. The Greek army was on the retreat, burning everything in its wake. And she remembers everyone escaping to the hills above, where she said, we waited for 3 days and 3 nights, warmed by the heat of the town burning below. She remembers the window panes exploding like bombs, and the sacks of grapes stuck together, bubbling like jam. She told about the cows and the horses, like balloons with their legs in the air. She remembers the heat and the hunger and the smell of the fear.
Smyrna in August 1922 was a picture of calm. There had been vague rumours that there had been reverses on the battlefield, that the Greek army had suffered a series of minor difficulties, but no one believed them, no one thought they could be true. The first inkling that something really disastrous had happened came on the 6th of September, when the first of the defeated Greek soldiers began to trickle into Smyrna. They were in miserable condition, wounded, in bad shape, and they were just desperate to get out of the country. They told an appalling story of death and bloodshed on the battlefield. They began to embark onto the Greek ships that had been brought into the harbour to take them home. In their wake came numerous refugees, thousands and thousands of families with their children, with their grandparents, carrying nothing but water, a bit of food, and anything else they could bring with them as they fled from their homes. And most of them came onto the quayside, the 1.5 mile long quayside, which in better days had been the place where people had come from their evening strolls to drink their evening drinks and to come for their evening meals. Now it was full of hundreds of thousands of refugees. By the 7th of September, the battleships of the Allied powers began to converge in the Bay of Smyrna. Rumours of the Greek defeat had now reached the Allied commands, and they wanted to take off their own nationals and the Levantine families. But for most of the citizens of Smyrna, they simply didn't panic. They didn't believe any disaster would befall their city, because no one in the city believed that the Turkish army would enter Smyrna. Because whenever people opened their windows and stepped onto their balconies, they saw a most reassuring sight. 21 Allied battleships in the Bay of Smyrna and the Greek fleet next to them. They knew that these would protect them from any harm.
My grandfather was away, and maybe he was in the army, I'm not sure. And the Turkish men, they knew, came to the house and said, Mrs. Eleni, I can help you take your children and get out, because they're going to cut off transportation and you're going to be trapped here. And my grandmother, maybe she did not want to believe what the Turkish gentleman was saying, so she didn't take that advice. And this story points to me that difficult juncture of the old and the new, with the Turkish people trying to help the Christian people and explain to them that that old world is now collapsed, and then the Christian families not wanting to accept it, not wanting to believe it, that that would ever happen.
That same day, there was another significant event that took place. The Greek government, headed by Addis, left the city. There was now no one running, no one in control of Smyrna. And many of the Greeks and the Armenians were extremely alarmed by this development, and they too decided it was time to leave. But when they tried to board the Greek ships, they learned that they were only taking off soldiers, because there was simply no room to take off the hundreds of thousands of Greeks living in the city. And then they learned that the foreign battleships were only taking off their own nationals. The Greeks and the Armenians were now trapped. Later on that afternoon, there was a most alarming sight. The Greek fleet suddenly weighed anchor and slipped out of the Bay of Smyrna to the sound of the Greek national anthem being played on board one of the French vessels. The American consul, George Horton, was one of the first men to witness the advance regiments of the Turkish cavalry riding into Smyrna. The first thing that he knew about it was the sound of screaming coming from outside the consulate as a band of 100 women tried to force their way into the consulate building. Aware that something dramatic had happened, he rushed out onto the balcony of the American consulate, which had a wonderful view right across the quayside of Smyrna. And what did he see? The Turkish cavalry was riding along the quayside. They had spotless uniforms, and they had their sabres, and they were shouting out, "Fear not, fear not." But the Greeks and the Armenians were in a complete state of panic. People rushed into buildings, locked themselves into their shops, into their brasseries, into their bars. And the Turkish cavalry continued silently and peacefully along the quayside. They rode towards the Konak, the large building at the end of the quayside, and there they symbolically took down the Greek flag and hoisted the Turkish one.
One memory is engraved in my mind that I can't forget. I remember looking through the window. There was a woman that was running away, and one of the soldiers in horses got off the horse but killed the person that was running and got back in his horse left. And then another soldier came in and took the body away. I didn't see a cavalry, but I saw one of the cavalry's behavior in the front of my eyes through the shutter of my home. Right across the street, I saw this. This is called cavalry. Well, they came in, they took over Smyrna. I was a child.
As dusk fell, troops began to converge from every different angle, from every different direction. And in their wake came the Chetty forces as well, the irregular forces, the undisciplined forces. At first, all went well. They all began to come into the city. But then, in the leafy suburb of Cordeleio, things began to go wrong. A young Greek boy called Petros Prasalis remembers looking at his parents and seeing absolute panic in their face, because the Turkish cavalry were riding along and they were dragging behind them the Greek flag in the dust on the ground. People began to hide in their houses, lock themselves into their cellars, and with good reason, because the Chetties who followed after the Turkish army began to break into the houses, and the first noises of screams began as people began to be killed. Violence began to spread out, not just from Corthelio, but now in Bornabat and in the city as well, in the Armenian and the Greek quarter. On Sunday, the 10th of September, at long last, Mustafa Kemal himself entered the city. He kept a very low profile. Very few people saw him on that day, but he did do one significant thing. He appointed Nuruddin Pasha, one of his close advisors, to become governor of the city. And this news, when it filtered out, filled everyone with alarm. Nuruddin Pasha hated foreigners, hated Greeks, and hated Armenians. It was a bad omen for what was to come. A dramatic event occurred that afternoon. The new governor of the city, Nuruddin Pasha, summoned Metropolitan Chrysostom to a meeting at his office. Now, in some ways, this came as no surprise, probably, to Chrysostom. He, after all, was the senior Greek hierarch in the city and representative figurehead of all the Greeks living in Smyrna. We don't know precisely what happened, but we know for certain that Chrysostom went to the office, went up to a meeting with Nuruddin Pasha, and it only lasted a few minutes. Chrysostom came down a few minutes later, and a large Turkish crowd had gathered outside. The story runs that Nuruddin Pasha stepped out onto his balcony and cried out to the crowd, "If he's done well with you, do well with him. If he's done harm to you, do harm to him." There was a group of French soldiers watching on at what happened, and they wanted to intervene. They knew that something bad was going to take place, but their commander said, "No, we're not intervening. We don't want to be seen to be siding with the Greeks." Chrysostom was grabbed by the crowd. They dragged him away into a back street. They shaved off his beard. They gouged out his eyes, and then they stabbed him to death. He died in the streets of his beloved Smyrna.
My Aunt Fofo told her daughter-in-law a story as they were getting ready to leave. Fofo said that the family sat down at the dining table and had tea. And then they washed the cups and the saucers and the teapot, and I imagined them porcelain set, and hung them back in their places, and then they left. And in some ways that's a more tragic image, in a funny way, than the truly tragic images of the Exodus that have been recorded, and of the people being killed.
The next thing I recall is our departure. My aunt had a connection at the French embassy. Suddenly, the news came from the embassy that the French sailor was going to come pick our family at night, at 11 o'clock at night when it was dark. In a few minutes, we had to bundle up something. And I remember leaving the house. I will always remember close shutters. Next thing, at night, we were in this boat going to the Jean Bar, a very large boat, and there were bodies floating around in the quay, in the city, in the docks, outside of the docks. That's Smyrna. That's what I remember. I remember the crowd, the darkness, the soldier taking my father away, and he escaped.
By the morning of the 12th, the Turkish army was out of control. Already that night, 2,000 Greeks and Armenians had been slaughtered in the suburb of Bornabat. And now the soldiers in the city itself, fueled by alcohol, were going on a rampage, killing, looting, and murdering wherever they could go. In the Armenian and the Greek quarter, very few people dared to step outside on that day, but 2 people did. The Anglican vicar, the Reverend Charles Dobson, and the American consul, George Horton. And they saw scenes that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Corpses everywhere, mutilated, people had been tortured, and cadavers all swollen up in the heat of the sun. What's amazing is that at the same time, there were hundreds of thousands of refugees still camped out on the quayside. One other thing of great significance happened that day. The wind dramatically changed direction. It was about mid-morning when a young Armenian lad happened to look outside and saw a most disturbing sight. A group of Turkish soldiers and a band of irregulars seemed to be sprinkling the buildings of the Armenian quarter with some sort of liquid. When they passed by, he went outside and sniffed it, and he realized what it was. They were sprinkling the buildings with petrol. Midday, and Miss Minnie Mills, a teacher in the city at the American Collegiate Institute, happens to glance out of her window and gets a shock. A funnel of smoke was pouring out of the Armenian quarter. And she saw worse than that. She saw Turkish officers and soldiers pouring petrol into the buildings. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Burge, the wife of an American missionary, also happens to look outside, and she sees a second column of smoke. It's not long, perhaps 20 minutes, before these columns of smoke, and other ones as well, all link up into one tremendous black funnel of smoke, which is pouring out of the Armenian quarter. The wind by now is whipping up a gale. It's blowing in away from the Turkish quarter, right across the town, and it's carrying the flames with it. Flames are now spreading out of the Armenian quarter into the other sections of the city, the European quarter and the Greek quarter. Flames are erupting out of buildings, and as the wooden frameworks of these buildings caught fire and burned, so the masonry came crashing down, bringing down whole streets of buildings were just collapsing into piles of rubble.
The family was back in Izmir from Manisa when the city began to burn. Gülfemiran remembers her grandfather taking the children to the seaside to watch the city burn from across the bay. She said he climbed up on a rock and watched for a long time until the flames engulfed their own property in the European quarter. She remembers him saying, "Bless you, thank God we are alive."
On board one of the warships in the bay were all the Levantine grandees who'd fled from Bornevat and were now watching the fire. It was terrible for the refugees caught on the quayside. They had nowhere to go. At one end, at the northern end, the Turks had set up a machine gun post. They'd done the same at the southern end. There was no way they could get off the quayside because on the eastern side, on the town side, the flames were now 200 feet high and pouring out smoke and incredible heat. The only hope of escape was to jump into the sea. This is what they did. Numerous refugees jumped into the sea and they swam out desperately to the warships at anchor in the bay, hoping that they'd be able to climb up the chains and get refuge aboard. But when they reached the ships, a terrible thing happened. The troops on board, the sailors on board, had been instructed not to allow any refugee on board the ships. They were tipping boiling water over the refugees. The sound of the screaming coming from the quayside was appalling. It was so loud, it was deafening, and it was hideous for all the mariners on board these ships. At one point, the admiral of the fleet ordered the ship's bands to play music, to strike up jolly music, to drown out the sound of thousands of refugees screaming on the quayside. That same night, on board the American warship where Consul Horton was stationed, he could see the Turkish army willingly and knowingly destroying the great city of Smyrna. Consul Horton looked out across the screaming mass of humanity, and he simply said, "The keenest impression I take away from Smyrna is the shame that I belong to the human race." The great powers could have done so much to intervene. They could have saved the lives of so many people, and yet they did absolutely nothing. Why? Because they knew that Mustafa Kemal had won this war, and in the hope of striking rich trading deals with him, they didn't want to be seen to be siding with Greeks and Armenians. They wanted trade over people's lives. To this day, there's great controversy as to who set fire to the great city of Smyrna, who actually lit the match that was to consume this city in a fireball. Turkish historians persist in saying that it wasn't the Turks, it was the Greek army as they retreated, burnt the city to the ground. But there are so many eyewitness accounts of people who were there, impartial observers, who saw Turkish irregular forces and, importantly, regular officers in the Turkish army actually setting fire to the city. People also point to the fact that on that very day, the wind direction changed dramatically. It swung round 180 degrees, so the wind was blowing from the Turkish quarter, which meant that the entire city would be consumed in flames, except for the Turkish quarter of the city. In some ways, the burning of Smyrna is simply a logical extension, a brutal one, but logical, to Kemal's policy of Turkey for the Turks. This was sweeping out the ethnic minorities in dramatic fashion, sweeping them out in a sea of flame.
When I asked Gülfem İrem who she thought burned Izmir, she automatically said the Greeks. And yet when I pursued it, she said there are three possibilities. The Greeks burned Izmir, the Armenians burned Izmir, the Turks burned Izmir. And intrigued by my questions and my persistence, she called her friend, an old lawyer from the same generation, and he said, there was a famous lawyer at the time, and he knew about an ammunition depot near the Armenian church, and he showed them the place, and they burnt it. But she didn't say who he showed them to. And Gülfem İrem said there was a conspiracy of silence about the fire. Nobody talked about it, so maybe we were guilty. And she said Mustafa Kemal was there. He was the liberator of Izmir. He was in the city, and yet she said they let the city burn.
For 24 hours, the men and the officers on board the warships watched a scene of absolute horror unfolding on the quayside with the fire burning in the background. And after a while, they realized they couldn't watch anymore. They had to do something. And so too did the Admiral of the fleet. He decided something had to be done. And he began a rescue operation and began to pluck off the 500,000 men, women and children who were stuck on the quayside. The descriptions of the men wrote afterwards of what happened, what took place as they tried to rescue these people, it makes for horrific reading. The sea was choked with the bloated corpses of people who tried to save themselves and died in the process. And in amongst them, young Turkish boys were swimming around, cutting off the fingers and the ears of these people in order to steal their jewelry. And as the boats arrived at the quayside, there was another terrible thing to meet these officers and men. People surged forward. They were so desperate to get away. Now they had this glimmer of hope. And they had to have clubs to beat back these people because they could only take a certain number on each of the ships.
The Turkish authorities declared all males, adult males, as prisoners of war, and most of them would not return from what was going to be a horrific experience. This left the old people, the women and the children still on the seafront, hoping that they would be somehow evacuated. The Turkish authorities did not want to tolerate the situation anymore and announced that the refugees had a deadline of September 30th. They had to be evacuated by then. If not, they would face uncertain consequences, certainly deportation, if not worse.
The Americans in the city now began to plead with the Turks. They said that something had to be done. These are individuals, people working for charity organizations, who simply couldn't watch this humanitarian catastrophe unfolding without doing something.
Asa Jennings, in charge of the YMCA, a Methodist, a devout Methodist from New York, is an unsung hero. And what made Asa Jennings a true hero, or what made him shine in all this, was his exceptional initiative to find ships and evacuate people in the middle of this bedlam. He went to the nearby island of Mytilene and found cargo ships, 17 or 20 cargo ships that were laying idle, and convinced the Greek government, which was also in a state of shock, didn't know what the hell was going on, to take these ships and evacuate people from the quay. Now, one must say that initially the Turks refused to allow Greek ships enter the harbor, and that's what made it very difficult for the Greeks to evacuate people. So it wasn't entirely the fault of the Greek state. But it began to dawn on the minds of the nationalist Turks that this was an ideal way of getting rid of all these people, and therefore they began to be more and more amenable to the idea of evacuation.
By the end of September, the quayside, once a mass of 500,000 desperate people, finally was empty and lay silent. The spectre to this, the backdrop to, was the Smyrna, the once glorious city of Smyrna, which now was nothing more than a charred, burnt-out shell. Smyrna had ceased to exist.
For the Greeks, the destruction of Smyrna was an end. It was the end of the great idea, and it was the end of a 3,000-year-long presence of Greeks on the coasts of Asia Minor. For the Turks, it was the beginning. It was the culmination of a 3-year-long war that enabled the Turks to build a new country, the new Turkish Republic. But the destruction of Smyrna was also the end of cosmopolitanism. It was the end of a multi-ethnic city. All of the cosmopolitan cities of the Eastern Mediterranean eventually disappeared and gave way to national cities. But of all of them, it was Smyrna that was ended with such horrific destruction.
When Gülfem was talking to me about the destruction, she said, in the new Turkish Republic, you couldn't have such a cosmopolitan city. Yet at the same time, she was conflicted inside, because she knew that with the destruction, her city was also being lost. She told the story of the fisherman who fished in his net and found a fish out of whose bowels came a box of jewels. She said it took months and months to clean the bay of the corpses. She said she watched for weeks on end as Turkish soldiers climbed up the hills with Greeks tied up in a column with grown beards and their hair on end, and they knew that they would be shot. And she said this went on for weeks and weeks. As a young girl, Gülfem grew up in a destroyed city. She had to walk through it on her way to school. She said, Izmir is very important to me, but no longer the city itself. It has become a place in my imagination. Even though I didn't lose my city, I wasn't forced to leave, and others were. Yet I too lost my city. It has become a place in my memory associated with my childhood.
I am now proud of saying I was born in Smyrna. I can't think of any other place in this earth, for the little I know, that can show a very, very little jewel example. Don't divide, live together, enjoy each other. Diversity is beautiful. In conclusion, that's what Smyrna has given me. The challenge of having to overcome the wrong of humanity in a sense of responsibility. That's what I was given. Smyrna gave me responsibility. That's the way it is. I would not have been what I am today if I were not born in Smyrna. That gave me the beginnings. That gave me the beauty of the country, the beauty of the love and the joy, the blue sky, the songs, the lights across the water on the other end to Cordillo. I mean, it's really a beautiful place, you know. It is really a beautiful. Why can you create anything like that? It doesn't exist anywhere else.
I really think people brought the place with them in their bodies, in their gestures, in their manners. And I can even understand the pride of where they came from, because you cannot take away the manners, even though in many, many cases they came with nothing else but the way of life. And it was dominant in my family, and I think it has become almost like an identity card or a mode of recognition that connects many of us grandchildren of refugees from Smyrna. On the one hand, the joie de vivre. On the other side, the longing.
I think Smyrna in Greece lives everywhere. It's very easy to say it lives in our food, in our music. For me, Smyrna is the way I live my life. Smyrna is a notion. You don't have to see it to feel it. Smyrna is an inclusive noun. It contains all the traditions, laments, laughter, celebrations. Smyrna is all of these things and much more. You don't have to live in Greece to experience Smyrna. You can live in London or in New York and still carry it with you. You can pack it and carry it with you at all times.